The sound comes first. Not engines, not voices, but wind, moving low and wide across a flat surface that gives it nothing to break against. It slides over packed snow and frozen earth, lifting fine grains of ice that scrape softly against metal. The air feels thin, brittle, as though it might fracture if disturbed too suddenly. A shape sits at the edge of the field. Its outline is familiar but altered by frost, softened by accumulation. The aircraft does not gleam. It absorbs light rather than reflecting it, its skin dulled by cold and repetition. Snow clings where warmth once lingered. Oil has thickened into something reluctant, slow to move. Nothing here feels ready, only waiting. Before you drift off, you can subscribe, but only if quiet stories like this belong in your listening hours. If you feel like it, tell us where you're listening from, or which moment stayed with you the longest. You're listening to echoes of war. You watch as figures move around the machine with deliberate care. Their motions are economical, practiced, reduced to what is necessary. Gloves stiff with ice brush against metal. A hand lingers on a panel longer than usual, as if listening through touch. Breath fogs and drifts sideways, carried off before it can settle. The ground beneath them is not ground in the way it once was. It has been pressed flat by boots and tires, hardened into a pale surface that reflects the sky without offering depth. There is no clear boundary between earth and air here. Everything shares the same color, the same muted tone, as though the landscape has agreed to remain quiet. Far above, the light is thin and colorless. The sun exists only as a suggestion, a brightness diffused through cloud and distance. Time feels suspended, less measured by hours than by changes in temperature, by the slow migration of shadow across snow that never fully melts. This place has learned to hold still. Movement is possible, but never free. Every action seems negotiated with the cold, every decision filtered through what the environment will permit. The airfield does not announce itself as dangerous. It simply persists, indifferent to intention. Somewhere beyond the edge of visibility, routes extend outward, arcs drawn across maps and memory. They curve around the top of the world, passing over water locked beneath ice, over land that offers no landmarks once the snow falls. These paths are flown not because they are safe, but because they exist. You are not told yet who will fly today, or where the route will end. Names are unimportant at this distance. What matters is the shared condition, the waiting before motion, the quiet negotiation between human design and an environment that does not respond. The wind continues its slow work. Metal contracts. Instruments rest in their housings, needles motionless, as if conserving energy. The aircraft remains where it is, neither abandoned nor alive, suspended between preparation and departure. Nothing has begun. Nothing has resolved. The Arctic holds its breath, not in anticipation, but in habit, and the field remains exactly as it was moments ago, unchanged, unhurried, unconcerned with what will soon pass through it. The aircraft does not hurry. Neither do the people around it. Here, speed is something that belongs to the air itself, not to those who move within it. Every gesture remains restrained, shaped by an understanding learned over time. Haste creates heat, and heat invites failure. Cold punishes excess. The figures continue their work in silence. A hatch is opened and closed. A tool is set down, then lifted again, as if its placement matters more than its use. These actions have been repeated so often that they no longer carry urgency. They exist as a rhythm, a way to pass safely through the minutes before departure. Beyond the field, the horizon refuses definition. Snow blends into sky without ceremony. Distance cannot be trusted here. It contracts and expands without warning. A shape that seems near may be far. A cloud that looks thin may carry weight enough to end a flight. The Arctic does not explain itself. You begin to sense how this place governs thought. Decisions are not made boldly. They are narrowed, trimmed down to what can be sustained. Ambition shrinks in the presence of cold. What remains is endurance, quiet, uncelebrated, repeated. This is not a story that moves quickly. It circles. It returns. It follows the same routes again and again, across frozen water and unmarked land, tracing paths that exist only because they have been flown before. The pilots who pass through this world do not conquer it. They negotiate with it, one flight at a time. Loss, when it comes, does not arrive loudly. An aircraft simply does not return. The space it occupied remains empty, absorbed by weather and routine. The work continues. The cold does not adjust. You are watching a war fought at the edge of habit, where danger is constant but rarely dramatic, where survival depends less on heroism than on restraint. It is a conflict shaped by repetition, by systems that continue regardless of outcome, by an environment that neither remembers nor forgives. If you choose to remain here, the pace will not change. The wind will continue to move across ice and metal. Aircraft will arrive and depart. Days will blur into one another, marked only by subtle shifts in light and temperature. What unfolds is not a sequence of victories, but a long exposure to conditions that leave their mark slowly. Stay with this story as it drifts forward. Let the cold set the rhythm. Let the silence carry you between moments. The same cold, familiar now. The airfield looks unchanged at first glance. Snow still lies flat across the surface, pressed hard by wind and use. The buildings remain low against the horizon, their outlines softened by frost. Nothing announces that time has passed. Only small details betray it, changes so ordinary they almost escape notice. Metal behaves predictably now. Panels contract in the same places each morning. Hinges resist at familiar angles. Oil thickens at known thresholds. The cold no longer surprises. It confirms expectations. What was once checked cautiously is now assumed, compensated for before observation demands it. You watch how this alters movement. Hands no longer hesitate before contact. Gloves are chosen without deliberation. Tools are set down exactly where they will not freeze into place. The body has learned the temperature, learned how long exposure can last before sensation dulls. The ground carries deeper memory. Tire grooves have hardened into shallow channels that guide movement without conscious steering. Footpaths have worn themselves into preference, directing traffic where resistance is least. The field has been trained by repetition as much as the people who cross it. Inside the hangars, breath still fogs the air, but no one reacts to it. The sight of vapor no longer signals cold, it signals presence. Warmth is not expected here, only the absence of immediate harm. The distinction has been absorbed. You begin to sense how the environment recedes as an object of attention. It remains everywhere, but it no longer commands focus. Cold has become background condition, like gravity. It is accounted for, not remarked upon. Outside, wind lifts snow briefly, then lays it back down. The motion barely registers. Crews continue working through it, adjusting posture slightly, leaning into it without comment. The Arctic is no longer an adversary in these moments. It is a constant. Aircraft wait in their places, coated evenly now, no longer standing out against the surface. Their outlines have merged with the field's visual language. What once looked vulnerable now appears integrated, as though the machines belong here, even if only temporarily. Time moves differently under familiarity. Minutes are not measured against discomfort anymore. They pass according to task completion, according to habit. The cold does not feel lighter, but it feels known. This is how hostility begins to change form, not by easing, but by becoming predictable, and therefore quieter. As the day advances into its pale band of light, the airfield continues to perform itself. Nothing new is introduced. There are no sudden shifts in weather, no dramatic changes in routine. And yet, the longer you watch, the more you recognize that something has altered, not outside, but within the way the place is being inhabited. Cold has become a language here, and everyone speaks it fluently. A glance at the sky is enough to estimate how quickly exposed skin will numb. A touch on a fuel line reveals whether it will flow as expected. A particular sound from a door hinge confirms the temperature more accurately than any instrument indoors. These are not skills learned all at once. They accumulate, shaped by repetition and consequence. You watch a crew member lift a tool and pause for the briefest moment, not in uncertainty, but in calibration. The pause is practical, a tiny adjustment of grip. The movement resumes immediately, smooth and economical. The body has learned what the mind no longer needs to articulate. There is a subtle confidence in the way systems are checked now. Gauges are read without narrowing the eyes. Fasteners are tightened to the same tension as always, even when gloves reduce sensitivity. Inspections happen at the correct points not because someone remembers them consciously, but because the sequence has become physical. The cold does not interrupt this. It is woven into it. Outside, the wind changes slightly, bringing a faintly different texture to the snow as it moves. The shift is registered only indirectly, through the way loose material gathers against one side of a structure rather than another, through the way footsteps sound marginally sharper or duller. No one pauses to interpret it. Adjustments happen without discussion. A collar is raised, a stance is altered, a task is completed a little faster. You begin to see why familiarity is dangerous here. When an environment becomes predictable, it becomes easier to ignore. The mind stops treating it as information and starts treating it as background. The Arctic loses some of its visible threat, not because it is less capable of harm, but because harm has been translated into routine management. An aircraft is prepared for departure with the same sequence as before. Covers are removed and folded. Surfaces are brushed. The engine is coaxed into work, its initial reluctance expected, almost comforting in its consistency. The sound rises, stabilizes, and the crew steps back without drama. When the plane finally moves, it does not feel like a departure. It feels like the continuation of a practiced loop, a motion that has happened so often that it no longer carries narrative weight. The aircraft lifts into a sky that remains pale and blank, and the field does not react. Snow settles again where it has been disturbed. Tools return to their places. Hands return to their tasks. Hostility has not diminished. It has simply become quiet enough to be carried without comment, and in that quietness, it begins to disappear from attention. As the day advances into its pale band of light, the airfield continues to perform itself. Nothing new is introduced. There are no sudden shifts in weather, no dramatic changes in routine. And yet, the longer you watch, the more you recognize that something has altered, not outside, but within the way the place is being inhabited. Cold has become a language here, and everyone speaks it fluently. A glance at the sky is enough to estimate how quickly exposed skin will numb. A touch on a fuel line reveals whether it will flow as expected. A particular sound from a door hinge confirms the temperature more accurately than any instrument indoors. These are not skills learned all at once. They accumulate, shaped by repetition and consequence. You watch a crew member lift a tool and pause for the briefest moment, not in uncertainty, but in calibration. The pause is practical, a tiny adjustment of grip. The movement resumes immediately, smooth and economical. The body has learned what the mind no longer needs to articulate. There is a subtle confidence in the way systems are checked now. Gauges are read without narrowing the eyes. Fasteners are tightened to the same tension as always, even when gloves reduce sensitivity. Inspections happen at the correct points not because someone remembers them consciously, but because the sequence has become physical. The cold does not interrupt this. It is woven into it. Outside, the wind changes slightly, bringing a faintly different texture to the snow as it moves. The shift is registered only indirectly, through the way loose material gathers against one side of a structure rather than another, through the way footsteps sound marginally sharper or duller. No one pauses to interpret it. Adjustments happen without discussion. A collar is raised, a stance is altered, a task is completed a little faster. You begin to see why familiarity is dangerous here. When an environment becomes predictable, it becomes easier to ignore. The mind stops treating it as information and starts treating it as background. The Arctic loses some of its visible threat, not because it is less capable of harm, but because harm has been translated into routine management. An aircraft is prepared for departure with the same sequence as before. Covers are removed and folded. Surfaces are brushed. The engine is coaxed into work, its initial reluctance expected, almost comforting in its consistency. The sound rises, stabilizes, and the crew steps back without drama. When the plane finally moves, it does not feel like a departure. It feels like the continuation of a practiced loop, a motion that has happened so often that it no longer carries narrative weight. The aircraft lifts into a sky that remains pale and blank, and the field does not react. Snow settles again where it has been disturbed. Tools return to their places. Hands return to their tasks. Hostility has not diminished. It has simply become quiet enough to be carried without comment, and in that quietness, it begins to disappear from attention. As the day advances into its pale band of light, the airfield continues to perform itself. Nothing new is introduced. There are no sudden shifts in weather, no dramatic changes in routine. And yet, the longer you watch, the more you recognize that something has altered, not outside, but within the way the place is being inhabited. Cold has become a language here, and everyone speaks it fluently. A glance at the sky is enough to estimate how quickly exposed skin will numb. A touch on a fuel line reveals whether it will flow as expected. A particular sound from a door hinge confirms the temperature more accurately than any instrument indoors. These are not skills learned all at once. They accumulate, shaped by repetition and consequence. You watch a crew member lift a tool and pause for the briefest moment, not in uncertainty, but in calibration. The pause is practical, a tiny adjustment of grip. The movement resumes immediately, smooth and economical. The body has learned what the mind no longer needs to articulate. There is a subtle confidence in the way systems are checked now. Gauges are read without narrowing the eyes. Fasteners are tightened to the same tension as always, even when gloves reduce sensitivity. Inspections happen at the correct points not because someone remembers them consciously, but because the sequence has become physical. The cold does not interrupt this. It is woven into it. Outside, the wind changes slightly, bringing a faintly different texture to the snow as it moves. The shift is registered only indirectly, through the way loose material gathers against one side of a structure rather than another, through the way footsteps sound marginally sharper or duller. No one pauses to interpret it. Adjustments happen without discussion. A collar is raised, a stance is altered, a task is completed a little faster. You begin to see why familiarity is dangerous here. When an environment becomes predictable, it becomes easier to ignore. The mind stops treating it as information and starts treating it as background. The Arctic loses some of its visible threat, not because it is less capable of harm, but because harm has been translated into routine management. An aircraft is prepared for departure with the same sequence as before. Covers are removed and folded. Surfaces are brushed. The engine is coaxed into work, its initial reluctance expected, almost comforting in its consistency. The sound rises, stabilizes, and the crew steps back without drama. When the plane finally moves, it does not feel like a departure. It feels like the continuation of a practiced loop, a motion that has happened so often that it no longer carries narrative weight. The aircraft lifts into a sky that remains pale and blank, and the field does not react. Snow settles again where it has been disturbed. Tools return to their places. Hands return to their tasks. Hostility has not diminished. It has simply become quiet enough to be carried without comment, and in that quietness, it begins to disappear from attention. As the day advances into its pale band of light, the airfield continues to perform itself. Nothing new is introduced. There are no sudden shifts in weather, no dramatic changes in routine. And yet, the longer you watch, the more you recognize that something has altered, not outside, but within the way the place is being inhabited. Cold has become a language here, and everyone speaks it fluently. A glance at the sky is enough to estimate how quickly exposed skin will numb. A touch on a fuel line reveals whether it will flow as expected. A particular sound from a door hinge confirms the temperature more accurately than any instrument indoors. These are not skills learned all at once. They accumulate, shaped by repetition and consequence. You watch a crew member lift a tool and pause for the briefest moment, not in uncertainty, but in calibration. The pause is practical, a tiny adjustment of grip. The movement resumes immediately, smooth and economical. The body has learned what the mind no longer needs to articulate. There is a subtle confidence in the way systems are checked now. Gauges are read without narrowing the eyes. Fasteners are tightened to the same tension as always, even when gloves reduce sensitivity. Inspections happen at the correct points not because someone remembers them consciously, but because the sequence has become physical. The cold does not interrupt this. It is woven into it. Outside, the wind changes slightly, bringing a faintly different texture to the snow as it moves. The shift is registered only indirectly, through the way loose material gathers against one side of a structure rather than another, through the way footsteps sound marginally sharper or duller. No one pauses to interpret it. Adjustments happen without discussion. A collar is raised, a stance is altered, a task is completed a little faster. You begin to see why familiarity is dangerous here. When an environment becomes predictable, it becomes easier to ignore. The mind stops treating it as information and starts treating it as background. The Arctic loses some of its visible threat, not because it is less capable of harm, but because harm has been translated into routine management. An aircraft is prepared for departure with the same sequence as before. Covers are removed and folded. Surfaces are brushed. The engine is coaxed into work, its initial reluctance expected, almost comforting in its consistency. The sound rises, stabilizes, and the crew steps back without drama. When the plane finally moves, it does not feel like a departure. It feels like the continuation of a practiced loop, a motion that has happened so often that it no longer carries narrative weight. The aircraft lifts into a sky that remains pale and blank, and the field does not react. Snow settles again where it has been disturbed. Tools return to their places. Hands return to their tasks. Hostility has not diminished. It has simply become quiet enough to be carried without comment, and in that quietness, it begins to disappear from attention. As the day advances into its pale band of light, the airfield continues to perform itself. Nothing new is introduced. There are no sudden shifts in weather, no dramatic changes in routine. And yet, the longer you watch, the more you recognize that something has altered, not outside, but within the way the place is being inhabited. Cold has become a language here, and everyone speaks it fluently. A glance at the sky is enough to estimate how quickly exposed skin will numb. A touch on a fuel line reveals whether it will flow as expected. A particular sound from a door hinge confirms the temperature more accurately than any instrument indoors. These are not skills learned all at once. They accumulate, shaped by repetition and consequence. You watch a crew member lift a tool and pause for the briefest moment, not in uncertainty, but in calibration. The pause is practical, a tiny adjustment of grip. The movement resumes immediately, smooth and economical. The body has learned what the mind no longer needs to articulate. There is a subtle confidence in the way systems are checked now. Gauges are read without narrowing the eyes. Fasteners are tightened to the same tension as always, even when gloves reduce sensitivity. Inspections happen at the correct points not because someone remembers them consciously, but because the sequence has become physical. The cold does not interrupt this. It is woven into it. Outside, the wind changes slightly, bringing a faintly different texture to the snow as it moves. The shift is registered only indirectly, through the way loose material gathers against one side of a structure rather than another, through the way footsteps sound marginally sharper or duller. No one pauses to interpret it. Adjustments happen without discussion. A collar is raised, a stance is altered, a task is completed a little faster. You begin to see why familiarity is dangerous here. When an environment becomes predictable, it becomes easier to ignore. The mind stops treating it as information and starts treating it as background. The Arctic loses some of its visible threat, not because it is less capable of harm, but because harm has been translated into routine management. An aircraft is prepared for departure with the same sequence as before. Covers are removed and folded. Surfaces are brushed. The engine is coaxed into work, its initial reluctance expected, almost comforting in its consistency. The sound rises, stabilizes, and the crew steps back without drama. When the plane finally moves, it does not feel like a departure. It feels like the continuation of a practiced loop, a motion that has happened so often that it no longer carries narrative weight. The aircraft lifts into a sky that remains pale and blank, and the field does not react. Snow settles again where it has been disturbed. Tools return to their places. Hands return to their tasks. Hostility has not diminished. It has simply become quiet enough to be carried without comment, and in that quietness, it begins to disappear from attention. Routes without landmarks. Once airborne, the world simplifies. The air strips away detail, leaving only gradations of light and movement. Snow below merges into cloud, cloud into sky, until the horizon becomes an idea rather than a line. There is no sense of depth here, no reliable cue to distance. Direction is maintained by instruments that must be trusted, even when they hesitate. Inside the aircraft, sound settles into a steady presence. Engines do not roar so much as endure, their rhythm constant, unyielding. Vibration passes through the frame and into the body, a reminder that motion continues even when nothing outside appears to change. The cabin is cold, but contained, a narrow pocket of human space suspended above emptiness. You watch the pilot's attention move between dials and windows, back and forth in a practiced pattern. The outside view offers little reassurance. The sky provides no reference, no horizon to lean against. What keeps the aircraft aligned is not sight, but habit, learned sequences repeated until they require little thought. The routes flown here are precise on paper. They arc cleanly across maps, measured in degrees and distances. In the air, those same routes feel provisional. Wind alters speed. Ice clouds obscure position. Navigation depends on calculation performed again and again, corrected by experience rather than certainty. Below, the landscape offers no acknowledgement of passage. Frozen water stretches uninterrupted for miles, its surface fractured into subtle textures that shift with light. Land, when it appears, does so without warning, a darker smudge against the white, gone again moments later. There are no towns, no roads, no signals to confirm location. Time behaves strangely in this space. Without visual markers, minutes lose definition. The body measures duration through sensation instead, the ache of muscles held still, the dryness of air drawn repeatedly into the lungs, the slow creep of cold through layers of clothing. You begin to sense how isolation works its way inward. There is no external confirmation that progress is being made. No visible change to mark advancement. The aircraft moves forward because the instruments say it does, and because stopping is not an option. Radio contact, when it comes, is brief and indistinct. Voices arrive distorted, compressed by distance and interference. Messages are exchanged efficiently, stripped of excess. There is no room for elaboration. Connection exists, but it is fragile. The Arctic does not reveal itself to those who pass above it. It remains surface and silence, offering no guidance beyond what has already been learned. Every mile flown reinforces the same lesson. Navigation here is an act of persistence, not perception. The aircraft continues along its invisible line, carrying its occupants through a sky that looks the same in every direction. There is no sense of nearing anything, only the steady continuation of motion, maintained by routine and trust in systems that must hold. As the flight continues, the cabin settles into a quiet endurance. There is little to adjust once altitude and heading are established. Hands return to familiar positions. Eyes trace the same circuit again and again, across instruments that glow faintly against the dim interior. Each reading is noted, then rechecked, not because it is expected to change, but because neglect invites error. Outside, light drifts almost imperceptibly. The sky does not brighten or darken so much as shift in tone, moving through subtle variations of gray and pale blue. Cloud layers pass beneath the aircraft, then rise to meet it, flattening depth until the plane seems suspended in a single color. It becomes difficult to tell whether movement is occurring at all. You sense how easily disorientation could take hold here. Without landmarks, without a visible horizon, the body's instincts lose authority. Balance becomes theoretical. Direction is abstract. Trust transfers from senses to procedure, from perception to calculation. This reliance is not dramatic. It is practiced, repeated, and rarely acknowledged. Small deviations require immediate correction. A slight change in engine sound prompts a glance, then another. Ice accumulation is checked indirectly, inferred from performance rather than seen. There is no dramatic build-up, only constant vigilance against minor failure. In this environment, catastrophe does not announce itself loudly. It begins quietly. Radio signals fade in and out, sometimes disappearing entirely for long stretches. Silence fills the space they leave behind. It is not unsettling at first. It becomes noticeable only when it persists, when the absence of external reference grows longer than expected. The aircraft continues regardless, following its invisible arc below. The surface remains unreadable. Ice reflects light unevenly, creating patterns that suggest movement where none exists. Shadows appear and vanish without explanation. The landscape resists interpretation, offering nothing that can be reliably named or remembered. Time stretches. The body responds with stiffness, with a dull ache that spreads gradually through joints and muscles held in place. Cold presses inward despite insulation, finding seams and lingering there. These sensations accumulate slowly, blending into the background of awareness until they feel normal. You begin to understand how repetition works at altitude. Each flight resembles the last closely enough that they blur together. Memory compresses them into a single extended experience, punctuated only by minor variations in weather or mechanical response. Progress is measured not by novelty, but by endurance. When the destination finally emerges, a hint of structure against the white, a shift in radio tone, a change in routine, it does not feel like arrival. It feels like a transition from one controlled exposure to another. The Arctic offers no sense of completion. The aircraft descends carefully, guided by instruments and inference. Below, the next airfield waits, indistinguishable from the last except by coordinates. Snow, ice, and wind prepare to receive another arrival, just as they have countless times before. The route is complete, but nothing resolves. Another invisible line has been traced across the sky, then absorbed into silence. The route, flown again. The route looks the same because it is the same. The arc traced across the map has not shifted. The headings match those flown before. Fuel calculations fall within the same narrow range. Even the weather, when reduced to numbers and probability, appears familiar enough to proceed without discussion. Inside the aircraft, this familiarity settles quickly. There is no moment of adjustment now, no brief recalibration as altitude is reached. Hands move into position almost before the aircraft levels out. The cabin assumes its steady state with minimal effort, as though it has been entered mid-flight rather than from the ground. You watch how attention distributes itself differently this time. The instruments are still checked, but the checks feel lighter, less deliberate. Eyes pass over familiar readings without lingering. The information is received and released immediately, absorbed into expectation rather than examined. Outside, the sky offers the same absence of reference. Cloud blends into ice, ice into distance. What once demanded interpretation now passes without comment. The lack of landmarks no longer registers as uncertainty. It has become a defining feature of the route, like its length or altitude. Time stretches again, but this stretching is no longer noticed. Minutes dissolve into one another without resistance. The body does not brace against stillness. It settles into it, conserving effort by reducing movement to what is strictly necessary. You begin to sense how repetition alters vigilance. Nothing appears wrong. Nothing calls for correction. The systems behave as they have before, reinforcing the assumption that they will continue to do so. Familiarity begins to substitute for confirmation. Radio silence returns in the same intervals as before. The absence of contact no longer prompts recalculation. It is logged mentally, then set aside. Silence has been assigned its place within the expected range of conditions. Below, the surface remains unreadable. The aircraft passes over the same expanses of ice and cloud that have been crossed many times already. These textures no longer invite curiosity. They exist as backdrop, not information. The route unfolds without incident, and that smoothness carries its own effect. Each uneventful passage reinforces the idea that this flight, like the last, will complete itself without demanding attention. The extraordinary has not vanished. It has simply stopped announcing itself. This is how repetition begins its quieter work. Not by changing what happens, but by changing how it is perceived. As the aircraft continues along its familiar arc, the cabin grows increasingly still. Not because effort has ceased, but because effort has been refined away. Movements are smaller now, more economical. The posture held by the body requires little adjustment. Stillness becomes efficient. You notice how checks are completed almost automatically. A glance confirms altitude. A hand adjusts power by feel rather than by sight. The sequence unfolds without interruption, each action flowing into the next with minimal conscious oversight. The route does not require discovery anymore. It requires maintenance. Outside, the Arctic offers the same blankness it always has. Ice and cloud flatten into one another, their subtle differences passing unnoticed. There is no longer a sense of crossing distance. The flight feels suspended in a continuous present, neither advancing nor retreating. The absence of landmarks no longer sharpens attention. Instead, it narrows it. Awareness collapses inward, focused on a small set of trusted signals. Anything outside that set fades quickly from consideration. This is not carelessness. It is adaptation to sameness. Radio contact, when it briefly returns, sounds thinner than before. The message is acknowledged without discussion. Once it fades, silence resumes its place without tension. The exchange does not alter behavior. It confirms only that the system remains intact. Below, the surface continues to offer no guidance. The aircraft crosses the same frozen expanses as before, but memory no longer distinguishes one crossing from another. The route exists as a repeated duration rather than as a series of locations. You begin to sense how this repetition reshapes judgment. The lack of incident becomes evidence. Each successful passage confirms the assumption that conditions remain stable, that the environment is behaving within acceptable bounds. Familiarity reduces the perceived need for scrutiny. The aircraft holds its course. Systems respond as expected. The flight proceeds without interruption. There is no moment that stands out, no detail that demands retention. The route completes itself, quietly, efficiently. When descent begins, it does not feel like arrival. It feels like continuation in another form, a transition from one familiar exposure to the next. This is how repetition settles in, not as boredom, not as neglect, but as a narrowing of attention shaped by success. On the ground again, movement resumes with familiar restraint. The aircraft settles into place, its weight transferring back to ice that accepts it without comment. There is no visible relief in arrival. The transition from air to ground changes the nature of exposure, not its presence. Crews approach with the same measured pace you have already seen elsewhere. The sequence unfolds as expected. Engines are brought down slowly, systems checked in a prescribed order, surfaces inspected for what the cold may have claimed during flight. Nothing here invites improvisation. Repetition is not monotony. It is protection. You watch the routines take shape around the machine. Tools are retrieved from the same locations. Hands follow the same paths across metal. Notes are made in the same cramped handwriting, their content nearly identical to those written the day before. Variation exists, but it is small. A temperature noted, a delay recorded, a component observed longer than usual. Inside the operations room, the atmosphere mirrors the field outside. Maps hang where they always have, their edges worn thin by use. Routes are traced again, lines reinforced with each pass. The room holds the quiet confidence of familiarity, but also its limits. Nothing here suggests progress, only continuation. Briefings occur without flourish. Information is exchanged efficiently, stripped of commentary. Weather updates. Mechanical status. Departure windows narrowed by forecast rather than ambition. Each flight is framed not as an opportunity, but as an obligation to be fulfilled within strict boundaries. You begin to sense how repetition shapes perception. Risk does not disappear. It becomes predictable. The extraordinary recedes. What remains is a narrow focus on execution, on doing the same things correctly, again and again, without deviation. Outside, snow continues its slow accumulation. Tracks fade and are replaced by new ones, pressed into the same paths. The airfield looks unchanged, but it is never static. Its surface records every movement, then erases it gradually, returning to uniformity. There is comfort in this cycle, not comfort in safety, but in familiarity. Knowing what comes next reduces the weight of uncertainty, even when the outcome remains unclear. Routine becomes a way to move forward without needing to reflect on what might happen if it fails. You watch as another aircraft is prepared nearby, its outlines nearly identical to the last. The same gestures are repeated, the same checks performed. It is difficult to distinguish one departure from another, and that indistinction is intentional. In the Arctic, repetition is not stagnation. It is the structure that allows work to continue at all. As hours pass, repetition settles deeper into the body. Movements require less conscious effort. Hands find switches without searching. The order of tasks becomes embedded, carried out even when attention drifts momentarily toward the cold pressing at the edges of awareness. Familiarity dulls friction, but it also thins alertness. You notice how conversation, when it occurs, circles narrowly around function. There is little speculation, little reflection. Words are used to confirm status, to verify sequence. Anything beyond that feels unnecessary, even indulgent. Silence fills the gaps, not awkwardly, but as an accepted part of the environment. Meals are taken quickly, often standing, their primary purpose to restore warmth and energy rather than to satisfy. Food tastes muted in the cold. Heat matters more than flavor. Cups are held between gloved hands longer than required to drink, absorbing what warmth they can offer before being set aside. Outside, the wind shifts direction without warning. Snow lifts briefly from the surface, then settles again. The change is noted, but it does not alter the routine. Adjustments are made quietly, incorporated into existing patterns. Repetition does not resist change. It absorbs it. You begin to see how this cycle shapes memory. Individual days lose distinction. What remains are impressions of conditions rather than events. A stretch of colder temperatures, a series of delayed departures, a period when visibility rarely improved. Time is recalled as atmosphere. Aircraft continue to come and go. Some return coated in ice, others bearing minor damage that is addressed methodically. Each arrival feeds back into the same system of inspection and preparation. Nothing escalates. Nothing resolves. There is a subtle narrowing of attention that accompanies this rhythm. Focus becomes local, immediate. The broader context of the war recedes, replaced by the demands of the next task, the next check. Repetition shelters the mind from scale. By the time darkness begins to deepen again, the airfield shows only minor signs of passage. A new set of tracks leads toward the hangars. One space remains empty longer than expected. Snow begins its work there as well. The routine holds. It holds because it must. Cold moving inward. Fatigue does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, carried in small adjustments that seem reasonable in the moment. A glove left on longer before being removed. A stretch of stiffness ignored. A checklist read once instead of twice. None of these feel consequential on their own. Together, they begin to alter the rhythm. The cold no longer remains at the surface. It settles deeper, lingering in joints and muscles even after movement resumes. Warmth, when found, feels temporary and incomplete, as though it cannot fully penetrate what has already been claimed. The body adapts by conserving motion, by choosing stillness whenever possible. You watch how posture changes over time. Shoulders rise slightly, guarding the neck. Hands move more slowly, deliberate not only from care but from resistance within the fingers themselves. Sensation dulls at the edges, making it harder to judge pressure, to feel when contact has been made firmly enough. Sleep offers limited restoration. Rest periods are brief, interrupted by noise, by temperature shifts, by the awareness that departure windows may open unexpectedly. The mind learns to remain partially alert even when the body lies still. Dreams, when they come, are shallow and fragmented. Inside the aircraft, fatigue manifests as a narrowing of tolerance. Vibrations that were once ignored now draw attention. Sounds linger longer in awareness. Concentration requires effort rather than emerging naturally. The instruments glow steadily, unchanged, while the eyes that read them grow slower to refocus. You begin to sense how error might enter this system, not through dramatic failure, but through omission. A check performed but not fully absorbed. A reading noted without reflection. Fatigue does not create recklessness. It creates quiet gaps. Outside, conditions remain consistent. The environment does not intensify in response to human wear. Wind continues. Snow falls or does not. Light shifts imperceptibly. The Arctic does not adjust its demands. It simply waits. Crews compensate instinctively. Tasks are double-checked by habit rather than instruction. Movements slow further, not out of caution alone, but because the body requires it. There is no discussion of exhaustion. It is assumed, shared, unremarkable. You watch as another flight prepares under these conditions. The same procedures are followed. The same cold is endured. The same fatigue is carried forward, accumulating without ceremony. This is not collapse. It is persistence under diminishing capacity. As the days continue, fatigue becomes less noticeable precisely because it is always present. What once felt like strain settles into the background, absorbed into the definition of normal. The body adjusts its expectations downward, accepting reduced sensation, slower response, narrower margins. You see this in the way tasks are paced. There is no rush to complete them quickly. Speed no longer offers advantage. Instead, movements are spaced carefully, allowing brief pauses between actions, not for rest, but to prevent error. Stillness becomes a tool. Inside the cabins and barracks, heat sources work constantly, never fully overcoming the cold. Air remains dry, thin, carrying the faint smell of fuel and metal. Clothing is arranged and rearranged, layers adjusted incrementally throughout the day. These small acts of management become as important as any mechanical check. Memory begins to blur at the edges. The distinction between one flight and the next weakens. What remains clear are moments of sensation, a sudden numbness in the hands, a sharp intake of breath when exposed skin meets air, the dull ache that persists even after movement resumes. Experience is stored in the body rather than in narrative. In the air, fatigue reveals itself through vigilance that must be renewed consciously. Attention is maintained by routine rather than instinct. The mind no longer reacts quickly. It relies on structure to compensate. Procedures are followed not because they feel necessary in the moment, but because they are known to matter. You watch as corrections are made earlier, more conservatively. Altitude is adjusted with greater margin. Course changes are gradual, deliberate. The pilots do not push. They accommodate the limits they now recognize, shaping each decision around what can be sustained rather than what might be possible. Outside the aircraft, the Arctic remains unchanged. Snow reflects light evenly. Clouds drift without pattern. There is no signal that conditions have worsened, no escalation to justify the strain accumulating within those who work here. The environment simply persists. At the end of a shift, there is no clear sense of completion. Work tapers off when it must, not when it feels finished. Fatigue does not recede with rest. It settles, waiting to be carried into the next cycle. This is how endurance reshapes perception. The body learns to function within constraint, to accept limitation without complaint. The war continues at a reduced pace, sustained not by strength, but by adaptation. Tiredness without comment. Fatigue no longer announces itself here. It has lost the sharp edges it once carried, the moments when stiffness or heaviness demanded attention. What remains is quieter, a steady narrowing of range that feels ordinary enough to ignore. You watch the way bodies move across the field. The pace is slower, but no one remarks on it. Movements are economical, trimmed of anything unnecessary. Tasks take longer not because of difficulty, but because the body now chooses restraint by default. Speed has ceased to offer advantage. Hands linger on surfaces a fraction longer before releasing. Knees bend more deliberately. Weight is shifted carefully, as though balance requires advanced planning. These adjustments are not framed as weakness. They are treated as experience, as good judgment shaped by time. Inside the aircraft, posture settles into positions that can be held indefinitely. There is no effort to remain alert through tension. Instead, alertness is maintained through structure, through sequences followed in the same order every time, through reliance on systems that have proven stable. You notice how cold interacts differently with fatigue. It no longer arrives as a shock. It seeps inward slowly, dulling sensation without urgency. Fingers lose precision gradually, encouraging gentler handling. Sensation fades in layers, making it harder to recognize when it has thinned too far. Sleep, when it comes, does not feel restorative. It functions more as suspension than recovery. Rest pauses decline without reversing it. The body resumes work from a slightly lower baseline each time, though the difference is small enough to escape measurement. No one names this change. There is no language for it that would be useful. Fatigue has been absorbed into the definition of normal, stripped of its capacity to warn. Outside, conditions remain stable enough to proceed. Wind holds steady. Visibility falls within acceptable bounds. There is no environmental reason to stop or delay. The body's quiet erosion does not register on instruments or reports. You begin to sense how risk shifts shape here, not through recklessness, but through accommodation. What would once have been flagged as strain is now managed internally, adjusted for rather than addressed. The work continues under these conditions without hesitation. Another aircraft is prepared. Another route is assigned. Fatigue is present, but it no longer occupies space. It has become background, like cold, like wind, like time itself. As this state persists, fatigue reshapes judgment in ways that feel reasonable at the time. Decisions grow more conservative, not out of caution alone, but because capacity has narrowed. Margins are widened subtly. Movements are planned with greater care. These adjustments are praised quietly as prudence. You watch how this reframing takes hold. Slower responses are interpreted as thoughtfulness. Reduced range is treated as discipline. What the body can no longer do easily is recast as what should not be done at all. The distinction between wisdom and wear becomes difficult to separate. Inside the aircraft, this appears as steadiness rather than strain. Controls are handled gently. Corrections are smaller, smoother, less frequent. The flight feels calmer, even as the effort required to maintain that calm increases. Fatigue does not disrupt routine. It is woven into it. The mind compensates by leaning more heavily on structure. Checklists are followed precisely, not because they demand attention, but because they relieve it. Procedures become a form of support, holding focus in place when spontaneity would cost too much energy. Outside, the Arctic continues its steady presence. Snow reflects light evenly. Wind moves without emphasis. There is nothing in the environment that signals decline or demands reassessment. The world appears stable enough to justify continuation. You begin to sense how this stability masks internal change. The absence of crisis is mistaken for health. The smoothness of operation conceals the fact that less is being carried than before. Fatigue reduces capacity quietly, without producing visible failure. At the end of a shift, there is no release. The body does not reset. It settles instead, holding its diminished range as the new baseline. Rest pauses the process but does not reverse it. The next day begins from the same position, slightly lower than the last. This condition does not feel urgent. It does not ask to be solved. It simply persists. And because it persists without protest, it becomes easier to overlook. The work continues, shaped now by limits that are no longer recognized as such, carried forward by adaptation rather than recovery. Capacity quietly reduced. By this point, fatigue no longer feels like a condition at all. It has become a constraint that shapes choices before they are consciously made. Decisions arrive already narrowed, their range defined by what the body will tolerate rather than by what circumstances might allow. You watch this at the edge of every task. Options are weighed quickly, not against ideals, but against effort. The choice that demands the least strain rises naturally to the surface. This does not feel like compromise. It feels like experience selecting what is sustainable. On the airfield, this expresses itself in subtle refusals. Tasks that once might have been attempted are deferred without discussion. Adjustments are made earlier, conservatively, to avoid exertion later. No one frames this as limitation. It is described as efficiency. Inside the aircraft, routes are flown with margins widened just enough to avoid correction. Headings are chosen for stability rather than speed. Altitudes are held where turbulence is least likely, even if fuel consumption increases slightly. These decisions are not debated. They feel obvious. You begin to sense how the body leads the mind now, setting boundaries that thought does not question. Fatigue has become a quiet authority. It does not issue commands. It defines what feels reasonable. The instruments reflect steady flight. Nothing appears amiss. The aircraft behaves predictably. The sky remains indifferent. From the outside, everything looks controlled, deliberate, even careful. But beneath that smoothness, capacity has narrowed. What once felt easy now feels excessive. What once felt normal now feels ambitious. You watch how this shift goes unremarked. There is no language for reduced range when nothing has failed. Success continues to arrive on schedule, reinforcing the belief that nothing essential has changed. Outside, the Arctic offers no contradiction. Weather remains within expected limits. Visibility fluctuates, but not dangerously. The environment does not press hard enough to expose what has been lost. Fatigue settles deeper into the system, not as weakness, but as preference. The work continues, shaped increasingly by what can be endured rather than by what might be possible. As this narrowed range persists, it begins to define the rhythm of the work itself. Schedules adjust subtly around it. Expectations recalibrate without announcement. What the body can sustain becomes the measure of what is planned, even if that measure is never stated aloud. You notice how this influences timing. Departures are arranged to avoid moments of peak strain. Tasks are spaced to allow brief recoveries between them. These changes are described as optimization, as sensible management of resources. The language remains neutral, technical, reassuring. Inside the aircraft, this adaptation produces a particular kind of calm. Movements are smooth, deliberate, unhurried. Corrections are rare because the path chosen leaves room for drift. The flight feels steady, almost effortless, even as it relies on a reduced range of response. The mind grows accustomed to this calm. It interprets the absence of strain as improvement. Fatigue, now embedded, disguises itself as mastery. The body's limits are no longer experienced as resistance, but as guidance. You watch how attention settles into a narrower band. Only what demands immediate response remains vivid. Everything else fades quickly from consideration. This focus feels efficient, but it leaves little room for reassessment. When capacity is reduced, curiosity often goes with it. Outside, the Arctic continues to present the same restrained face. Snow and cloud blur together. Light shifts gently without signaling urgency. There is nothing in the environment that challenges the new equilibrium. The world appears to agree with the adjustments being made. At the end of a flight, there is no sense of strain having been managed. There is only the sense that the work proceeded as expected. The absence of difficulty becomes confirmation that the chosen limits are correct. Over time, this reinforces itself. Each successful passage narrows the perceived need for greater capacity. The system learns to function smoothly within its reduced bounds, mistaking adaptation for stability. This is how fatigue completes its quiet work, not by stopping motion, but by redefining what motion looks like. Orders that arrive from elsewhere. The paperwork does not feel cold at first. It sits flat on tables, its pages clean and orderly, its language precise. Numbers align. Schedules are laid out in careful rows. From a distance, it appears insulated from the conditions outside, untouched by wind or ice. You watch as orders are read aloud or passed quietly from hand to hand. They arrive already formed, shaped by decisions made far from this airfield, in rooms where the temperature remains stable and the light predictable. Here they are received without comment, not because they are unquestioned, but because there is little room to negotiate. Flight times are assigned. Cargo weights calculated. Aircraft availability noted in neat columns. The system accounts for distance and duration, but not for fatigue that accumulates without record, or for cold that alters behavior in ways no form can capture. These factors exist outside the margins. Inside the operations room, the contrast becomes apparent. Maps show routes as elegant arcs, evenly spaced, their logic unbroken by weather or delay. Each line suggests continuity, a steady flow that must be maintained. The airfield is one node among many, its role defined by throughput rather than condition. You begin to sense how pressure enters quietly, not as urgency, but as expectation. Flights are assumed possible unless explicitly cancelled. Delays require justification. Losses are acknowledged, then folded into revised figures. The system absorbs disruption by adjusting elsewhere, maintaining the appearance of stability. Outside, crews continue their work in parallel. They prepare aircraft according to specifications that do not change with temperature or daylight. Adjustments are made informally, quietly, where they must be, but the official record remains clean. What cannot be expressed is managed through habit. The distance between decision and execution stretches invisibly across the Arctic. Those who fly and maintain the aircraft feel its tension, but it is diffuse, difficult to name. Orders do not demand recklessness. They simply assume capacity. You watch as a departure window is narrowed, then reopened, then narrowed again, all within the space of an hour. Forecasts shift. Conditions remain uncertain. The schedule, however, persists. It waits, ready to resume as soon as possibility returns. This is how bureaucracy settles into the environment. It does not confront the cold directly. It operates alongside it, parallel and indifferent, shaping behavior through expectation rather than command. As the system continues to operate, its presence becomes easier to overlook. Orders arrive regularly, predictably, their language unchanged by what happens on the field. They do not speak of ice forming faster than expected, or of hands that shake slightly longer after exposure. They speak in totals, in averages, in anticipated flow. You watch how this shapes behavior without being discussed. Crews prepare aircraft knowing that delays ripple outward, affecting schedules beyond this place. The awareness is subtle, internalized. No one voices it directly, but it guides choices all the same. Caution is balanced against expectation, safety against continuity. Inside the operations room, revisions are made quietly. Times are shifted. Loads redistributed. A line is drawn through a flight number, replaced by another. Loss appears here as an adjustment rather than an event. The language remains neutral, procedural, almost gentle. Outside, the Arctic continues its steady pressure. Wind rises and falls. Snow gathers along edges and corners. The airfield absorbs these changes without altering its function. What changes instead is the margin within which people work. It narrows, gradually, as obligations accumulate. You begin to see how responsibility becomes diffuse. Decisions are made in fragments, distributed across distance and time. No single moment carries the weight of consequence. Each action feels reasonable, justified within its limited scope. Together, they form a system that moves forward regardless of strain. When an aircraft does not return, the response is measured. Search windows are noted, probabilities calculated, reports prepared. The field itself does not change. Another flight is already being planned, its route penciled in with the same care as before. There is no malice in this process. It is impersonal rather than cruel. It sustains itself by remaining abstract, by translating lived conditions into manageable data. What cannot be translated is left unspoken. You watch as crews read the next set of orders, adjust their routines, and continue. The paperwork stacks neatly. The air remains cold. The system holds. This is how pressure persists without raising its voice, through repetition, through distance, through the quiet assumption that endurance will continue to meet demand. Numbers that no longer surprise. The paperwork feels lighter now, not because there is less of it, but because it is handled with less attention. Pages are turned quickly. Figures are scanned rather than studied. The forms have been seen often enough that their shape alone communicates most of what is needed. You watch how reports are received. Losses appear as adjustments, not disruptions. Delays are absorbed into revised timelines without comment. The language remains precise, unchanged, and increasingly familiar. What once required explanation now requires only acknowledgement. Inside the operations room, this familiarity creates a quiet efficiency. Orders are interpreted rapidly, filtered through what has already been experienced. Schedules are not questioned, they are calibrated. What cannot be met is deferred. What can be met is assumed. You begin to sense how expectation has shifted. Earlier, each set of figures carried uncertainty. Now, variation is anticipated. The system does not expect smooth flow, it expects friction. Irregularity has been incorporated into planning, flattened into averages and tolerances. Maps are still updated, routes still traced, but the gestures have grown smaller. The hand moves without hesitation, marking changes that no longer carry narrative weight. A line ends abruptly. Another begins nearby. The surface grows denser, layered with revisions that do not require explanation. Outside, the airfield continues its work in parallel. Aircraft are prepared according to schedules that account for delay as a given. Nothing here suggests urgency. Continuation has replaced precision as the primary value. You notice how this affects responsibility. Decisions are no longer framed as responses to conditions on the ground. They are framed as alignments with expectation. The system plans for loss without naming it, allowing operations to continue without pause. The numbers do not feel cold, but they feel distant. They represent activity without reflecting effort. Fatigue, weather, and absence have been translated into manageable increments. What remains untranslatable is left outside the margins. This is not indifference. It is abstraction. The work proceeds under the quiet assurance that the figures already account for what might go wrong, and because they do, there is little reason to stop. As this abstraction settles in, it begins to shape behavior subtly. The figures on the page no longer provoke reaction because they no longer feel provisional. They describe a range of outcomes that has already been accepted. Variance exists, but it is expected, folded neatly into the structure of planning. You watch how this changes conversation. Language grows economical, stripped of qualifiers. Reports are delivered without emphasis. Questions are asked only when something falls outside the established band. What remains within it passes without comment, regardless of the effort it represents. Inside the operations room, this produces a particular calm. Decisions are made quickly, almost reflexively. There is confidence in the system's ability to absorb strain, to compensate elsewhere for what cannot be achieved here. Responsibility disperses across charts, schedules, and probabilities. The distance between calculation and experience widens. Numbers circulate freely, but the conditions they summarize remain elsewhere, unexamined. Cold becomes a coefficient. Fatigue becomes a delay. Absence becomes a gap to be filled by reassignment. Each translation makes continuation easier. Outside, the airfield responds in kind. Crews align their work with expectations that arrive already shaped by abstraction. Schedules are treated as flexible yet persistent. Delays are anticipated, not resisted. The system and the field move in parallel, rarely intersecting directly. You begin to sense how this mutual adjustment reinforces itself. Because the figures expect strain, strain no longer demands attention. Because loss is anticipated statistically, it no longer interrupts planning. The system appears resilient precisely because it no longer reacts. When a flight does not return, its absence enters the record smoothly. Times are noted. Routes are reassigned. The line on the map remains unbroken elsewhere. There is no visible disturbance. Continuation is preserved. This is how bureaucracy completes its quiet work. By making endurance legible without making it visible. By allowing operations to proceed without requiring reconsideration. The numbers settle back into their places. The pages are turned. The next set of figures arrives, already familiar. The space an aircraft leaves behind is unremarkable at first. A gap along the line. A patch of ice newly exposed to wind. For a time, it looks temporary, as though the machine has merely stepped away and will return to reclaim its place. You watch how the airfield responds, or rather how it does not. No markers are placed. No area is cordoned off. Snow begins its slow work almost immediately, softening the edges of tire tracks, pressing flat the impressions left behind. The field restores its surface without ceremony. Inside the operations room, the absence is acknowledged quietly. A notation is made. A time is recorded. The line on the map remains, but its endpoint is left open. There is no need to explain what that means. Everyone understands the implication without articulation. You notice how conversation adjusts. The missing aircraft is referred to indirectly, if at all. Language avoids finality. Delayed. Unconfirmed. Still out. These terms allow time to pass without forcing recognition. They hold the space open, just enough. Outside, preparation continues. Another aircraft is already being serviced nearby. The same procedures unfold, uninterrupted. Tools move from hand to hand. Covers are folded. Fuel lines are checked. The rhythm remains intact. You begin to sense how loss is absorbed here. Not denied, but thinned out, spread across routine until it no longer presses sharply against awareness. Grief, if it exists, is deferred, diluted by necessity. There is no place to set it down. As hours pass, the gap becomes easier to overlook. Snow settles more evenly. New tracks form beside it. The airfield regains its familiar symmetry. Absence blends into pattern. In the air, flights continue along their routes. Crews pass over the same frozen expanses, guided by instruments and habit. The missing aircraft is not visible from above. The Arctic offers no trace, no marker to acknowledge what has not returned. You watch as attention shifts fully back to the present. The next departure window. The next set of figures. The next adjustment. What is gone does not demand further response. The system moves forward by design. This is how normalization begins. Not through indifference, but through repetition that leaves no space for pause. As days pass, the language surrounding loss settles into a narrow range. Phrases repeat. Forms are filled. Probabilities are updated. What began as uncertainty gradually hardens into assumption, though it is rarely named as such. The process is quiet, procedural, almost gentle in its pacing. You watch how the routines adapt. Another aircraft is assigned to the route. Schedules shift slightly to compensate. The map remains crowded with lines, its surface growing denser with each revision. The missing line is not erased. It is simply no longer referenced. Outside, the field looks unchanged. Snow has leveled the surface where the aircraft once stood. There is no sign that anything has been removed. New arrivals fill the space without hesitation. The environment accepts replacement without resistance. You begin to sense how emotional response is managed here. Not suppressed, but deferred indefinitely. There is no ceremony for those who do not return. The Arctic does not provide a place for it. Distance and weather prevent recovery. Absence becomes abstract. In the air, crews continue their work under the same conditions. The same risks apply. The same routines are followed. Awareness of loss exists, but it does not alter behavior in visible ways. To do so would disrupt the system that keeps movement possible at all. You notice how expectations shift subtly. Each departure carries the understanding that return is not guaranteed, but this knowledge does not intensify. It flattens. The extraordinary becomes expected. Survival feels incidental. Time continues to pass without clear markers. Days merge into one another. What remains are patterns. Flights completed, flights delayed, flights that do not reappear. The distinction between them grows less sharp. This normalization does not feel like surrender. It feels like accommodation, a recalibration of what is considered acceptable, sustainable, inevitable. The airfield continues to function. Orders arrive. Aircraft depart. Snow falls. The system holds, not because it is unaffected by loss, but because it has learned how to carry it without stopping. The missing no longer marked. The absence no longer draws the eye. Where an aircraft once stood, the space fills quickly, not with replacement at first, but with indifference. Snow smooths the surface. Tracks overlap and erase one another. The line reforms without effort, its symmetry restored before anyone needs to comment on what changed. You watch how this is registered, or not registered, on the field. No one pauses at the gap. No one gestures toward it. The place where something failed to return is treated the same as every other patch of ice, a surface to cross, to work upon, to move past. Inside the operations room, the adjustment has already occurred. The schedule reflects it without explanation. A route has been reassigned. A number has shifted slightly. The record remains complete. Nothing appears unresolved. You begin to sense how language has thinned. Earlier, absence required euphemism. Now it requires nothing at all. There is no need to soften what is already expected. The missing aircraft has become part of the pattern, not an interruption to it. Outside, preparation continues at the same pace. Tools are lifted and set down. Covers are removed and folded. Fuel lines are connected and disconnected. The work does not hesitate, because hesitation would have nowhere to land. You notice how attention avoids the question of why. The system does not ask it. The environment does not answer it. The absence is treated as a condition that exists without needing explanation, like weather or distance. In the air, flights continue over the same expanses. Crews pass above places where others did not return, though nothing below marks those moments. The Arctic offers no reference point for loss. It does not preserve location. It does not distinguish one silence from another. You begin to understand how loss becomes ordinary here, not through denial, but through exposure. When absence repeats often enough, it loses its capacity to demand response. It is absorbed into routine as another expected outcome. The line holds. The field remains operational. The work continues without visible pause. This is how normalization settles in fully, when what is missing no longer needs to be acknowledged to be carried forward. As this condition persists, absence stops carrying narrative weight altogether. It no longer arrives as a question to be answered or a gap to be explained. It exists as a known quantity, folded into planning the same way, whether variance or mechanical, where has been folded in before. You watch how expectations adjust quietly around this. Each departure carries an unspoken understanding that return is conditional, not assumed. This understanding does not heighten tension. It flattens it. Risk loses its edge when it is anticipated rather than confronted. Inside the operations room, the record grows denser. Columns fill. Margins tighten. The missing are not named again. Their absence is represented only by continuity elsewhere, a reassigned route, a redistributed load, a line extended from another origin point. The system maintains its shape. Outside, the field reflects this flattening. There is no ritual to mark what has not returned. No pause in movement. Snow erases distinctions quickly, smoothing surfaces until they look identical again. The ground does not remember where loss occurred, and no one asks it to. You begin to sense how survival itself changes meaning under these conditions. Returning from a flight does not feel like relief. It feels neutral. Completion is expected. Non-return is expected too. Both outcomes now occupy the same emotional range. In the air, this neutrality expresses itself as restraint. Flights are conducted with the same quiet care as always, but without the earlier tension that came from uncertainty. The work proceeds within a narrowed emotional bandwidth, protected from extremes by familiarity. This does not feel like indifference. It feels like accommodation. Loss has been processed so many times that it no longer disrupts attention. It does not demand reaction or reflection. It is carried forward as background condition, no heavier than the cold or the silence that surrounds it. The system holds because it no longer reacts. The field remains active because it no longer pauses. The Arctic continues to offer no commentary. This is the final stage of normalization, when absence becomes part of the landscape, and the work goes on without needing to name what is missing. Survival without emphasis. By now, return has lost its distinction. An aircraft appears at the edge of visibility, resolves into shape, settles onto the field, and the moment passes without reaction. No one marks it as success. No one pauses to acknowledge that it could have ended otherwise. You watch how this absence of emphasis feels natural. Survival no longer carries emotional weight because it no longer represents deviation from expectation. It is simply one of several outcomes that occur regularly enough to feel ordinary. On the ground, procedures resume immediately. Engines wind down. Systems are checked. Covers are replaced. The aircraft is absorbed back into the line with no ceremony. Its presence is functional, not symbolic. Inside the operations room, the return is noted with the same neutrality as everything else. A time is entered. A column is updated. There is no contrast drawn between what arrived and what did not. Both are handled with equal procedural calm. You begin to sense how meaning drains from outcome when repetition becomes complete. Earlier, survival implied effort rewarded. Now it implies nothing beyond continuation. The work does not validate itself through success. It sustains itself through persistence. In the air, this flattening expresses itself as composure without relief. Pilots complete flights without the release that once followed landing. The end of exposure does not feel like resolution. It feels like transition, from one sustained condition to another. Outside, the Arctic offers the same response it always has. Snow settles. Wind moves. Light shifts without emphasis. The environment does not distinguish between return and absence. It does not elevate survival above disappearance. You watch how this indifference is mirrored inwardly. Emotional response has been pared down to what is necessary to continue. There is no space for celebration, no space for despair. Both would disrupt the narrow equilibrium that allows work to go on. This is not numbness. It is calibration. Over time, this calibration hardens into habit. What once required adjustment now feels intrinsic, as though the system has always operated this way. Survival, absence, continuation, all are received with the same evenness, processed through the same narrow channels of response. You notice how this shapes memory. Flights blur together not because they are identical, but because none demand retention. Nothing stands out strongly enough to be carried forward. The mind stores duration rather than detail, atmosphere rather than event. Inside the aircraft, the end of a flight no longer brings a sense of release. Engines winding down feel procedural, not conclusive. The body transitions from one controlled exposure to another without pause. Rest, when it occurs, feels provisional, a holding pattern rather than a conclusion. On the field, the rhythm remains uninterrupted. Aircraft arrive and depart. Tools move. Hands repeat their sequences. The absence of reaction becomes a signal in itself. Nothing has occurred that requires change. You begin to sense how meaning has shifted location. It no longer resides in outcomes. It resides in continuity. The measure of success is not return, but the ability to keep going without disruption. This does not feel heroic. It does not feel tragic. It feels quiet. The Arctic remains indifferent, as it always has. It neither resists nor rewards endurance. It simply provides the conditions within which repetition unfolds. When the work eventually thins, when flights grow fewer, when schedules loosen, when the system begins to release its hold, the transition does not register as an ending. There is no moment of closure to mark the shift. The war does not leave this place dramatically. It dissolves. What remains is a pattern that once sustained itself through necessity, now fading without needing explanation. The landscape absorbs the change without commentary, just as it absorbed everything else. This is how survival loses its emphasis, not because it mattered less, but because repetition carried it beyond the point where meaning could attach. Silence over the radio. Silence is not unusual here. Radio contact has always been intermittent, shaped by distance, interference, and weather. Messages fade in and out, clipped by static, compressed by necessity. Long stretches without communication are expected, accounted for. Still, there are moments when the quiet takes on a different weight. You watch the radio operator listen more intently than before. Headphones are adjusted. A dial is turned slowly, then returned to its original position. The same frequencies are scanned again, not in panic, but with a narrowed focus. Silence is evaluated rather than feared. Inside the aircraft, the absence of external voices is familiar. Engines provide their constant presence. Instruments glow steadily. The cabin feels sealed off, self-contained. Without radio contact, reliance shifts inward, to procedure, to timing, to memory of previous flights along the same route. The Arctic below remains unchanged. Ice stretches outward, uninterrupted. Cloud layers drift without pattern. Nothing in the landscape signals difficulty or reassurance. The sky offers no commentary. You begin to notice how silence shapes time. Without incoming messages to mark progress, minutes stretch unevenly. Attention turns inward, circling familiar checks. The mind fills the space left by absent voices with calculation, with repetition, with restraint. On the ground, silence is logged. A time is noted. The lack of response is not immediately alarming. Protocol allows for it. The system is designed to tolerate absence up to a point, though that point is rarely named aloud. You watch as the airfield continues its work while waiting. Another aircraft is prepared. Orders are reviewed. Weather is reassessed. Silence exists alongside activity, neither interrupting nor directing it. As time passes, the quiet becomes more noticeable, not because it is loud, but because it persists. The expected window for response closes, then another opens. Still nothing arrives. No one raises their voice. There is no visible urgency. The response remains measured, procedural. Silence is treated as a condition to be managed, not a crisis to be announced. This is how uncertainty settles in, not suddenly, but through the extension of quiet beyond what was anticipated. As the silence continues, it begins to occupy space, not physically, but mentally, a presence defined by its duration rather than its intensity. The absence of sound becomes something that must be held alongside every other task, carefully, without allowing it to distort judgment. You watch how attention narrows further. Conversations, when they occur, stay close to function. Weather updates are repeated. Timings are recalculated. The radio remains on, its faint static filling the background like wind against a wall. No one turns it off. Inside the aircraft, the lack of contact changes little on the surface. The flight proceeds according to plan. Altitude is maintained. Course adjustments are made conservatively. Silence does not alter the mechanics of flight. It alters the margin of reassurance. The Arctic offers no amplification of concern. Ice and cloud remain indifferent. From above, there is no visible indication that communication has failed or that waiting has begun. The environment remains neutral, offering neither threat nor relief. On the ground, protocol begins to shift subtly. Search windows are discussed quietly, hypothetically. Calculations are made without emphasis. The language stays conditional, allowing action to be delayed without appearing negligent. You begin to sense how systems absorb uncertainty. Silence is translated into intervals, thresholds, probabilities. It is given shape through process, rendered manageable. What cannot be managed is left unspoken. When the silence eventually resolves, either through contact re-established or through its extension beyond expectation, It does not feel like a turning point. It feels like another variation within a familiar range. Relief, if it arrives, is muted. Concern, if it deepens, remains contained. The radio continues to hum. The aircraft continue to move. The Arctic remains unchanged. This is how silence functions here, not as absence, but as a condition woven into routine. It does not stop the system. It becomes part of it. The weight of continuation. By now, the cycle no longer announces itself. It unfolds without emphasis, carried forward by expectation rather than intention. Aircraft arrive. Aircraft depart. The spaces between these movements are filled with preparation, maintenance, waiting, all performed with the same measured restraint you have seen before. You begin to sense how continuation becomes its own pressure, not imposed loudly, not enforced through command, but sustained through the assumption that what has been done will continue to be done. The system leans forward slightly, always inclined toward the next action. On the field, this manifests as readiness that never fully relaxes. Tools are kept close. Aircraft remain positioned for movement even when conditions deteriorate. Crews hover in a state between rest and engagement, conserving energy without fully disengaging. The body learns to remain partially prepared at all times. Inside the operations room, the rhythm is steady. Reports are updated. Routes are reviewed. Deviations are noted, then absorbed. There is little discussion of stopping, only of adjusting. Continuation is framed as flexibility rather than insistence. You watch how this affects decision-making. Choices are shaped not by what would be ideal, but by what allows the system to persist. Flights are delayed rather than cancelled. Routes are shortened rather than abandoned. Risk is redistributed rather than reduced. Outside, the Arctic remains constant. Snow covers evidence of previous days. Wind smooths edges. The environment offers no signal that continuation is wise or unwise. It simply endures. In the air, pilots carry this pressure quietly. There is no sensation of being pushed. Instead, there is an awareness of alignment, of moving in step with a system that expects motion. The instruments reflect this continuity, their readings steady, their glow unchanged. You begin to understand how momentum replaces urgency. There is no single reason to continue, only the absence of reason to stop. Each successful flight reinforces the expectation of the next. Each return validates the process without offering reassurance. This weight is subtle. It does not crush. It settles. As continuation becomes habitual, its effects deepen quietly. What once required justification now feels automatic. The question shifts from why fly today to why not. The absence of interruption is interpreted as permission. You watch how this logic spreads across the field. Minor risks are reclassified as tolerable. Delays are shortened by degrees. Margins are adjusted incrementally, each change small enough to feel reasonable on its own. No single decision feels decisive. Together, they redefine what is considered acceptable. Inside the aircraft, this pressure expresses itself through steadiness rather than haste. Pilots maintain their routines with care, aware that consistency is the only defense against fatigue and environment alike. The system does not ask for boldness. It asks for reliability. The body responds by conserving effort where it can. Movements become economical. Speech remains minimal. Energy is reserved for moments that cannot be postponed. This restraint is not reluctance. It is adaptation to a rhythm that allows little deviation. Outside, the Arctic continues to provide no commentary. Weather shifts, but within expected bounds. Light changes, but without drama. There is no external signal to interrupt the cycle. The environment neither rewards nor punishes continuation directly. It simply remains. You begin to sense how this constancy creates its own vulnerability. When everything feels normal, deviation becomes harder to recognize. Warning signs blend into background variation. The extraordinary is absorbed into routine before it can be named. Yet the system holds. Flights complete. Aircraft return. Loss, when it occurs, is processed without disruption. The field remains operational. Orders continue to arrive. Continuation proves itself through persistence. By the time rest is taken, if it is taken at all, it feels provisional. Sleep is light. Attention remains partially engaged, ready to resume. The cycle does not pause. It narrows. This is how endurance reshapes expectation. Continuation becomes the default state, carrying weight not through force, but through absence of alternative. The Arctic remains. Eventually, the season begins to shift, not abruptly, not decisively, but by degrees that are easy to miss. Light lingers slightly longer at the edge of the day. Shadows soften. The cold loosens its grip just enough to be noticed, though not enough to release what it holds. You watch how the airfield responds without comment. Routines remain unchanged. Clothing is adjusted incrementally. Procedures continue as written. The system does not acknowledge transition. It absorbs it quietly, as it has absorbed everything else. Aircraft lift into skies that look marginally different, though still vast and indifferent. The horizon remains indistinct. Navigation still depends on calculation and trust rather than sight. The environment does not transform. It only alters its pressure. In the operations room, maps remain crowded with lines. Some routes are flown less often now, others more. The adjustments are subtle, embedded in scheduling rather than announced. What matters is not the reason for change, but the fact that movement continues. You begin to sense how time has stretched across these routines. What once felt temporary now appears enduring. The war here does not feel like a chapter that will close. It feels like a condition that has been lived into, normalized through repetition. Outside, snow still covers the field, though its surface changes texture. Ice softens slightly during the briefest moments of daylight, then hardens again. The ground records these shifts faintly, then erases them. In the air, crews continue to operate within narrow margins. Fatigue remains present, though its character changes. The body carries a longer memory now, one shaped by months rather than days. Endurance has settled into posture, into reflex. You watch as another aircraft departs, its movement unremarkable against the pale expanse. There is no sense of culmination, no indication that this flight differs from those that came before. The Arctic does not signal that anything is ending. This persistence becomes its own form of silence, not absence, but continuity without comment. As time extends beyond its earlier bounds, memory adjusts to accommodate it. What once stood out now blends into a broader field of experience. The mind stops marking individual days. Instead, it holds on to conditions, a long stretch of cold, a period of unreliable weather, a sequence of departures that arrived and departed without distinction. You watch how this affects reflection. There is little impulse to look back in detail. The work has demanded attention in the present for too long to allow for sustained retrospection. What has been done exists mostly as residue, in worn equipment, in habits refined by necessity, in bodies that carry a quiet record of endurance. On the field, traces of earlier months remain faintly visible. A repaired surface here, a structure reinforced there. Each adjustment reflects a lesson learned without formal acknowledgement. The Arctic has shaped the infrastructure as steadily as it has shaped those who move within it. In the air, the sky continues to offer no markers of progress. Flights pass over the same expanses, guided by instruments and experience. The routes have been flown often enough that they exist as remembered sensations rather than as visual journeys. Navigation has become internalized. You begin to sense how the absence of resolution settles in. There is no clear endpoint to anticipate, no moment when the work will be declared complete. The war elsewhere may shift, but here, in the high latitudes, continuation remains the defining state. Orders still arrive. Aircraft are still assigned. The system persists, sustained by its own momentum and by the absence of interruption. Even as conditions soften slightly, the habits formed under harsher constraints remain. Outside, the Arctic continues its slow cycle. Snow gives way to ice, ice to water, then back again. Light increases, then recedes. These changes occur without emphasis, absorbed into the larger pattern of endurance. What remains most clearly is the environment itself. It has outlasted every departure, every return, every absence. It has witnessed movement without reacting, loss without marking, effort without acknowledgement. The Arctic remains, not as a stage, but as a condition that has shaped everything that passed through it. Long after the routes have quieted, the Arctic continues its work. Wind moves across ice with the same patience it always has. Snow falls, settles, lifts again. Light returns and withdraws according to cycles that do not record names or dates. The air remembers nothing of schedules or orders. The airfields still exist in traces. A flattened expanse where snow behaves differently. A line of structures softened by time and weather. Metal that has been reclaimed by rust and frost. What remains is subtle, almost accidental, evidence that activity once passed through, not that it belonged. You watch how memory behaves at this distance. The war compresses. Events blur. What survives is not sequence, but sensation. Cold that seemed endless, silence that stretched beyond expectation, motion maintained without assurance of outcome. The Arctic does not preserve stories. It preserves conditions. In archives and reports, the flights are counted, distances measured, losses tallied. The language is precise, restrained, necessary. It offers coherence where lived experience offered only endurance. The gap between those records and the environment they describe remains wide. Those who passed through this world carried its imprint quietly, not as triumph, not as tragedy, but as a recalibration of what could be borne. The body remembers what the record cannot: the weight of cold, the narrowing of attention, the steady acceptance of risk as ordinary. You sense how these impressions fade unevenly. Some dissolve quickly, absorbed back into routine elsewhere. Others linger, resurfacing in unexpected moments, in silence, in open space, in weather that behaves without regard for intention. The Arctic does not claim ownership of these memories. It does not offer them meaning. It simply remains. In the end, there is no clear moment when it stops. The Arctic does not mark conclusions. It does not distinguish between wartime and aftermath, between urgency and memory. Wind continues to move across open ground. Light continues its slow return and withdrawal. Ice forms, breaks, and reforms without acknowledgement of what once passed above it. You stand at a distance now, watching this landscape without obligation. The routes that once traced invisible arcs through the sky have faded back into abstraction. Nothing remains to indicate where one flight ended or another failed to return. The surface has been leveled by time and weather, its memory erased by repetition. What lingers instead is a quieter truth. That endurance does not always look like progress. That systems can persist without resolution. That human effort, when placed inside an environment that does not respond, becomes an act of maintenance rather than transformation. The Arctic pilots did not conquer this place. They moved through it, again and again, under conditions that asked only whether continuation was possible. The war receded elsewhere in moments of declaration and surrender. Here it dissolved more slowly, not through ceremony, but through the gradual easing of necessity. Flights became fewer. Orders thinned. The cycle loosened its grip without ever fully breaking. Even now, the sky above the high latitudes carries the same silence, the same depthless light, the same indifference to intention. If you watch long enough, you can imagine the distant hum of engines returning, not as memory, but as echo. This is what remains after the movement stops. Not victory, not defeat, but a landscape that held human persistence without absorbing its meaning. You've been part of echoes of war, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.